There's a debate that keeps coming up in e-commerce right now, and honestly, it is one of the most misunderstood topics in the entire space. A lot of people still ask, should you still source from China or should you go local? And the funny thing is, most people have actually a very strong opinion on this. But here's the thing. I think, like, in my perspective, both sides are usually missing the point entirely, because the question was never really about where the product is actually coming from, but what are you actually doing with it? Like when you actually receive it. And this is what I want to cover in this video today. I want to really give you an honest breakdown that nobody's in this space is actually willing to have. Now, if you've been following this channel, then you'll know that I've worked across hundreds of e-commerce businesses over the last 13 years. And if you haven't subscribed or watched the previous video, I strongly encourage you to do so. So I've been, involved into dropshipping stores, like starting completely from scratch, but also brands like doing 7 to 8 figures a month. And I've seen this debate, like with the supplier debate, play out in pretty much every single category or niches that you can imagine. For instance, like supplements, fashion, home and decor, beauty and skincare, photography, accessories, fitness and sports, and much more. Even like in print on demand, like, with the relationship cards, for example, that I had. But the thing is, what I've learned is the country of origin is not a problem. And honestly, it never was. And I also want to make something very clear here before I get any further into this video. There is nothing wrong with sourcing from China. To be honest, let's do this test. Check the labels currently, like on the clothes that you're wearing right now, and I can bet you most of them are actually coming from China or any similar countries, even if you're wearing like premium brands. The thing is, the difference between a cheap product and a premium one isn't where it's coming from. It's the quality control and the expectation that you set with your customer. That's it. So here's how I actually think about supplier decisions. And I want to break this down by category because the right answer generally depends on where you're actually selling. But before that, there's one principle that actually applies to every single category. The supplier decision is a strategic positioning decision. It's not just a logistics one. The thing is, where your product comes from actually affects how the customer perceives it. And smart operators, they will, use this like deliberately to leverage the perceived value of their own product. For instance, let's start with supplement. This is one of the few categories where I'd almost always recommend starting with local suppliers. And the reason is not because China cannot produce supplements, nowhere near that. They actually do quite a lot. But it's more because of regulation that matters here. Because at the end of the day, this is something that is going to go into someone's body. So you need proper testing, you need proper certification, and sometimes even the premium perception that comes from, local manufacturing that is generally worth like the higher cost. And to be fair, the brands that I've worked with in this space, like, supplement, almost all of them use local suppliers, especially at the start. And that was definitely the right call. Now, let's talk about fashion, because this one surprises like quite a lot of people. China and Vietnam, as you probably know, are where most of the world's clothes are actually manufactured, including brands that you would consider premium. But here's the thing, the difference isn't really the control, it's the quality control that comes with it. That's what actually separates like a $10 t-shirt from a $100 one that is actually coming from the same region. Obviously, branding is part of it, but still. Now, you see, like in Portugal, where I'm, for example, some brands actually do source from here because they want to have this made in Europe positioning. But here's the reality. Unless you're actually doing some serious volume, the shipping cost is going to start like eating your margin at the point where it really stopped making sense for most businesses to start there. Therefore, I still think China and Vietnam remains, the most practical starting point for fashion, but it doesn't mean that you have to stay there. Now, let's talk about home and decor, because China also gives you access to large variety and price points that you simply can't replicate like anywhere else. And here's also something that I need to mention here, because it's something a lot of people don't necessarily know, but people will wait longer for home and decor products more than any categories. Because let's take an example of my friend, for example. He's ordered a couch in a physical store in Australia. He went in it, like chose it and paid for it. Guess what? He had to wait like 6 to 9 months. But the thing is, nobody actually complained. And that was because the expectation was set correctly from the start, and the product was actually worth like, the weight for. The thing is, the same logic actually applies in e-commerce. If you're honest about the delivery times and you're actually delivering the product and it fulfills the promises, the customer will be willing to wait. Now, let's talk about beauty and skincare, because this is where it gets really interesting. You can absolutely source from China when it comes down to beauty products. I think they have a lot of it, to be honest. But what you need to make sure is that you've done some tests properly, get certifications, but overall, more importantly, making sure that whatever you're putting on someone's skin has been properly validated, so you prevent any big issues further down the line, like skin reaction or allergies. But here's the opportunity that most people completely overlook. It's South Korea, because K-beauty has built an enormous amount of cultural credibility, globally, that sourcing, from Korean manufacturers doesn't just give you a better product overall. It gives you a positioning advantage that, has already been built into the consumer's perception. And that is massive, because sometimes that's even worth more than the margin difference in many cases, I would say. And the same principle also applies to Japan for, let's say, cameras or photography, accessories, or even any precision products, because Japanese engineering has the perception of quality and precision that most consumers already hold. Almost nobody in e-commerce is going direct to Japanese manufacturers. At least I don't know anyone, which means the opportunity is less crowded and the positioning advantage is much more significant. But then you also have these other categories, like printed products, like cards, books, or anything bulky, that kind of look like this with a lower perceived value. And in fact, I was working on this myself, if you remember, with the relationship cards brand that I had in Australia. And I was at some point, I haven't mentioned this before, but at some point I was even, considering seriously whether to buy a printing machine and just doing it myself. Doing the math on ink, paper costs, and finding a local, print factory. Because with bulky, low perceived value items, international shipping costs generally eat your margins very quickly. So for these categories, almost as an exception, I would say local manufacturing or print on demand often makes more sense, than shipping from China, at the start. And the economics just works better when the weight to value ratio is unfavorable to international shipping. Now, here's something that I see consistently inside of our community. We have a lot of community members that try to source, from Europe, especially from the start, because let's say they want to go from Poland, Portugal, local suppliers, because they just want to avoid, that bad perception that comes from China. But the thing is, they quickly discover that the margins becomes too thin to run the business, properly. And it literally puts their whole business at very high risk. So they eventually, most of them come back to the same conclusion, that it's better to manage delivery expectation rather than just killing the margin trying to source locally before the volume actually is able to justify it. And that is not a failure. That's just understanding how the economics of e-commerce actually work. And this brings me to something I really want to address directly, because the number one complaint about China, sourcing isn't really about China in itself. It's about the expectation management. When someone orders something and it takes let's say 3 weeks to arrive without any communication, they feel deceived. But when someone buys, let's say, a new car, they actually end up waiting weeks or months, but nobody complains because the expectation was set very clear from the very beginning. So same principle, completely different experience at the end of the day. The thing is, if you're sourcing from China and delivery takes 2 to 3 weeks, say that, very clearly up front, because that will save you a lot of headache. Be transparent about it. Communicate during the process if there's any further delay. Most customer, I can tell you, they will accept if the product is actually taking longer, but as long as you've been honest with them. The problem is never really the wait. The problem is the bad surprises that comes with it. Now, here's the part that ties everything together. And if you've been watching this channel from the beginning, this is where it all connects. You don't have to make the perfect supply decision from day one. You probably won't be able to, but you want to start with what exists, source from China. And if the economics works, test the products, understand what customers love, what they complain about, and then you will start improving it. Better quality, better supplier relationship, maybe switching supplier like for a better one, better packaging. And as the volume grows, consider whether, premium sourcing, let's say like from Korea, Japan, Vietnam, or even local sourcing starts to make sense for your positioning, but also like for your margins, because don't fool yourself when it comes to this. The supply decision actually evolves, as the business evolves. So don't jump straight, like let's say if you're in fashion, like to Portuguese cotton before you've even proven if people want to buy your t-shirt. But once you have the volume and the proof of concept, then that's when the premium sourcing become a genuine competitive advantage. And that's when you can start charging like more as well. And when you do create something, genuinely unique, don't forget to protect it, because if you remember from the previous video, you need to have patent, trademarks, and copyright, like wherever is applicable, before you actually scale. Because if you remember, I had to learn that lesson with the relationship cards, the very hard way and expensive way. So don't make that mistake yourself. Now, if you need to take something out from this video, and I really thank you, like if you've gone that far into the video, stop asking where the product comes from. Start asking yourself different kind of question. Does the quality, match the expectations that I've set? Is the origin of the product adding something into my positioning? And do the margin works at the volume that I'm currently doing? Answer those questions like honestly, and the supplier decision becomes much easier. Now, I'm curious, have you ever avoided like a supplier because of where they're based, only just to realize later that the origin, of where the product was coming from wasn't actually the issue? Let me know in the comments, because I think there are actually a lot of people that are currently going through this and nobody actually talking about it honestly. Most products you see in the biggest brands in the world are actually made in China or Vietnam, or even somewhere where most people would raise an eyebrow at. And I guess that's not completely the story. The story is, what are those brands actually did in terms of quality control? Like, how did they set the right expectation that allowed them to be where they're at today? And with the supplier relationship, that they've actually built over time. My take from this is, start where the economics make sense, test properly, and improve consistently. And as you grow, the supplier decision, will eventually evolve with the business, because the origin is where you start, but it doesn't have to be where you stay.